In the year 1967, the British Parliament passed a bill called the Sexual Offences Act, a piece of legislation that served as a crucial stepping stone for the advancement of gay rights in the United Kingdom. The act stated that sexual acts between homosexual men of the consenting age of 21 in private were to be decriminalized. The age of consent for homosexuals was later changed to 18 and then 16. This act was very exclusive as it didn't apply to the armed forces, navy, and other parts of the UK, such as Scotland and Northern Ireland. Although this revisiting of the law seemed to be a step forward for the LGBTQ+ community, it still had numerous limitations and much more room for improvement. The motivation behind the Sexual Offences Act of 1967 was the gay community demanding equal rights and an end to discrimination, which prompted homosexuals and allies to protest and vocalize more for their rights, eventually resulting in more pro-LGBTQ+ laws and a greater public tolerance and acknowledgement of the LGBTQ+ individuals. Before the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, members of the LGBTQ+ community had been facing extreme societal and systemic discrimination and oppression for hundreds of years in the United Kingdom. Like many other countries of the time, the United Kingdom was very unaccepting of people who didn't meet their stereotypical norms. In the UK, there was a great amount of discrimination centered around the gay community because a same-sex relationship was seen as unnatural. Dating as far back as the 1500s with the rule of King Henry VIII, same-sex relations between homosexual men were outlawed and were punishable by death. With enabling from the government and societal values, homophobia thrived in the UK. In the 1800s, it became illegal to execute men based on their sexual orientation, but remained criminally punishable by law. Alas, it wasn't until the 20th century that many members of the gay community started becoming more public about advocating for LGBTQ+ rights to political leaders. The gay community would hold protest marches and parades led by organizations such as the Homosexual Law Reform Society and the Gay Liberation Front, who fought for equality in the UK. As a result of this increased effort, even more gay men than ever before were being convicted of gross indecency for embracing their sexuality. Regardless, the LGBTQ+ community and their allies still felt the necessity of advocating for their rights. Leo Abse, a member of parliament during the 1950s and 60s, was a pioneering ally that fought for the advancement of the gay community. Abse was an avid contributor to the Wolfenden Committee, a group formed in 1954 to combat anti-gay discrimination. The Wolfenden Committee began releasing journals called the Wolfenden Report that would be sent to political leaders, giving them a template for what the LGBTQ+ community would like to be seen put into law to promote equality. Activist groups like the Wolfenden Committee and others made valiant efforts for more LGBTQ+ visibility in British legislature that eventually led to the beginning stages of the Sexual Offences Act of 1967. With the passing of the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, the British Parliament was moving towards establishing what they thought was a more equal United Kingdom. The reality was that within the law, gay people still had very few rights and also were highly discriminated against, but this was some of the first legislators to really review and try and work on LGBTQ+ rights. The major conflict of this event is the overwhelming homophobia that was instilled into British culture. For hundreds of years, the gay community had been oppressed and persecuted for simply loving who they love. This kind of homophobia had just become a normal occurrence in British society that the LGBTQ+ was degraded to barely anything. It was this disregard for the gay community that caused the LGBTQ+ community to start fighting and advocating for their basic human rights. The compromise in all of this would be the actual passing of the Sexual Offences Act of 1967. This act outlined the legislation of same-sex acts between two consenting males over the age of 21 in private. Initially, this compromise was praised because it was one of the first pieces of legislation in the history of the United Kingdom that explicitly called for the advancement of LGBTQ+ individuals towards equality. Though this act was very flawed, considering the age of consent for gay couples was much older than that of straight couples, and it didn't outline any ways that LGBTQ+ people would be protected in accordance to these laws in the general public. Although this act is still looked upon as a great compromise for the gay community in the UK at that time, because their advocacy had finally paid off and earned them a piece of legislation that brought them closer than they were before to equality.
The immediate impact of the Sexual Offences Act of 1967 was most felt by homosexual men who were explicitly mentioned in the bill and was seen as a sign of optimism in the gay community. Though, as LGBTQ plus people were still being oppressed, this prompted them to create more awareness for the necessity of gay rights. The Sexual Offences Act of 1967 acknowledged some basic rights that gay people deserve and finally allowed members of the LGBTQ plus community to somewhat be able to express themselves more publicly. Although homophobia was still thriving and gay people were still discriminated against with everything they did. Although the Sexual Offences Act was federal law, few local authorities followed the act and continued to arrest and criminally punish individuals of gross indecency, even if they just seemed gay. But it wasn't just the local authorities in the UK that were the issue. The general public of the UK still maintained very anti-LGBTQ plus values. At the time of the Sexual Offences Act's passing, the majority of British citizens didn't believe that homosexuals deserved the right to hold a respectable position in society, let alone be represented by the law. Based on the unchanging beliefs towards them after the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, the LGBTQ plus community decided to make immediate action. They began forming more organizations than ever, like Stonewall and Outrage, to advocate for gay rights. Also, they began seeing more allies and members of the LGBTQ plus community being represented in the British government, who assisted in fighting the good fight. Although the initial reaction by the LGBTQ plus community was positive toward the Sexual Offences Act, they soon realized it did not do much to protect them from discrimination from the general public, prompting them to take action to fight for their rights and raise more awareness for the necessity of gay rights in the United Kingdom. The Sexual Offences Act of 1967 could be seen in a way as a catalyst for the heightened awareness for gay rights and a foundation for the gay rights movement in the second half of the 20th century. Although the Sexual Offences Act of 1967 was very flawed, it gave the LGBTQ plus community the confidence to be more vocal about gaining their basic human rights, sparking many organizations and events that led to major accomplishments in the gay community in the succeeding decades. New organizations were founded after the passing of the act, like Stonewall, Outrage, the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, and the Homosexual Law Reform Society. Two influential leaders of the gay rights movement were the founders of the Stonewall organization, Ian McKellen and Michael Cashman. These groups were big on advocating for justice, rights, and equality for the LGBTQ plus community through peaceful protest, demonstrations, and newsletters. All these organizations were active for many decades, and some, like Stonewall, are still active today. Many events took place following the act, like London having its very first Pride March in 1971, the first openly gay member of Parliament came out in 1984, and in 2000, the British government allowed homosexuals to join the armed forces. Other things that took place was a Euro Pride March in London with over 100,000 participants in 1992, the age of consent being lowered to 16, the same as a heterosexual person, in 2001, and in 2003, a homophobic law from the 1980s that stated a same-sex marriage family setting couldn't be taught or talked about in schools was repealed. All in all, LGBTQ plus rights in the UK gradually became a more talked about subject and more important to the government to make sure the gay community was receiving the same rights and privileges as everyone else, a direct result of the brave work of all who contributed to the gay rights movement. The Sexual Offences Act of 1967 was passed to decriminalize same-sex acts between two men in private over the age of 21 in the United Kingdom, though it was used by the LGBTQ plus community as a talking point to further advocate for their rights and challenge society to become the more accepting place that it is today. Before the act was put into place, the general public in the UK had a completely different view on LGBTQ plus rights, and such individuals were discriminated against out of fear and ignorance. With the conversation presented by the gay community that those ideas were in fact very wrong, people began to band together and advocate for what was right in a very successful manner. The way that they handled it was appropriate for gaining what they wanted, and although it did start off slow, still with limitations to what LGBTQ plus people could and couldn't do, it eventually brought the community together with the love and support from the United Kingdom.